He said 3 words in Mandarin, then switched to Portuguese, then to something none of them could place. The boardroom went completely still. Nobody moved. Not the lawyers at the far end of the table. Not the 4 members of the Stellarian delegation who had flown in from Geneva. Not Sandra Beaumont, who had been CEO of Harwick Consolidated for 11 years, and had never, in all that time, seen anything stop a negotiation like that. The man standing near the service cart at the back of the room wasn't supposed to speak at all. His name was Walter Pruitt. He was 61 years old, and he wore a gray maintenance uniform that had been washed so many times the name patch on the chest had faded to almost nothing. He had been part of the custodial staff at Harwick's downtown Toronto office for going on 6 years. He came in before dawn, cleaned the floors on the 34th and 35th floors, and was usually gone by the time the executives arrived. Nobody paid much attention to him. That was, he had learned long ago, one of the quiet advantages of the job. On the morning of March the 14th, Walter had been asked to remain on site through the afternoon to handle a catering setup for the board meeting. A last-minute request, the kind that got made when the facilities coordinator was overwhelmed and nobody else was available. Walter had agreed without complaint, as he always did, and had spent the morning arranging glassware and restocking the water pitchers and trying to stay out of the way. He had not intended to be in the room when the negotiations began. But Sandra Beaumont had specifically asked that someone from facilities remain nearby in case the catering needed attention, and the only someone available was Walter. He had stationed himself at the corner, beside the rolling cart, with his hands folded, and he had made himself small the way he knew how to do. The meeting had started at 1 o'clock. The deal on the table was worth $340 million. Harwick Consolidated manufactured specialized medical imaging equipment, the kind of machinery that large hospital networks and research institutions acquired in multi-year contracts. Stellarian Group, a Swiss-based consortium, was looking to secure exclusive distribution rights across 7 European markets. If it went through, it would be the single largest contract in Harwick's history. Sandra had prepared for 6 months. She had hired 3 external consultants, 2 translation firms, and a legal team that billed at rates that made her wince every time she looked at the invoices. She had flown to Geneva twice. She had revised the term sheet 11 times. She had also, at significant expense, arranged for professional interpreters. 2 of them, both highly credentialed, one specializing in French and German, the other in Italian and Dutch. The Stellarian delegation spoke English adequately but had requested that certain technical and legal passages be rendered in their native languages as a condition of the meeting. Sandra had agreed. It seemed a reasonable accommodation. What she hadn't anticipated was that the interpreters would begin struggling within the first 40 minutes. The Stellarian delegation communicated among themselves constantly. Small asides, murmured exchanges, rapid clarifications passed between the 4 of them like notes in a classroom. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that they did not stay in one language when they did it. They moved fluidly and apparently without intention between French and Italian and what sounded like German but wasn't quite, and occasionally into something else entirely. The interpreters caught pieces. They missed others. The one handling French and German had leaned over twice to confess to Sandra's assistant that she was having difficulty following the pace of the switching. The lead of the Stellarian delegation was a man named Peter Lund. He was lean, precise, 60-something, with the manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this one and found them only mildly interesting. He asked questions in English, listened to the answers, then turned to his colleagues and spoke in whatever language suited him at the moment. His colleagues responded. He turned back and smiled. Sandra had been a CEO for long enough to know what misdirection looked like. She wasn't certain that was what this was, but something about the rhythm of it was making her uneasy. At the 2-hour mark, the conversation turned to the royalty structure. This was where it mattered most. The per-unit licensing fee, the territory exclusivity clause, the minimum volume commitments. These were the numbers that would determine whether the deal made sense for Harwick or simply looked like it did. Sandra's CFO, a careful man named Jeffrey Park, had built a model that showed exactly where the floor was. They could not go below a certain per-unit figure without turning the contract into a liability. Peter Lund's team had been pushing gently on that number for the better part of an hour. The pushback was pleasant, oblique, wrapped in expressions of enthusiasm for the partnership and concern about European market conditions. It was the kind of negotiation that looked like collaboration and functioned like erosion. Then Peter Lund said something to his colleague in the language that wasn't quite German, and Walter Pruitt, standing at the back of the room beside his cart, went very still. He had not meant to listen. He never meant to listen. But there are things that the ear catches before the mind can intervene, and what Walter heard Peter Lund say, in Romansh, which is spoken by fewer than 40,000 people in the canton of Graubünden, was this: they haven't checked the annex clause. If we get them to agree to the volume minimum before they look at the annex, the conversion rate kills the floor. His colleague responded in the same language quickly. How long before someone notices? Peter Lund's answer was almost inaudible, but Walter was close enough. They won't. Not before signing. The interpreters don't have it. Walter stood with his hands folded and said nothing. He looked at the cart. He looked at the window. The room was full of people who had no idea what had just been said. He looked at Sandra Beaumont, who was nodding carefully at something Geoffrey Park was explaining to her in a low voice, and he thought about what he was holding and what it would cost him to put it down. The thing about Walter Pruitt was that nobody at Harwick Consolidated knew very much about him. He had applied for the custodial position 6 years ago, with a resume that listed a trade certificate, a brief stint with a property management company, and a reference from a church in Mississauga. The hiring manager at the time had found him pleasant and reliable, and that had been sufficient. What the resume did not mention, because Walter had not seen the need to mention it, was the 22 years he had spent before that, the decade in international logistics, moving between offices in Montreal, Lyon, Zurich, Sao Paulo, and Singapore. The languages he had accumulated the way some people accumulate frequent flyer points, not as an achievement but as a side effect of being somewhere long enough that the sounds started to make sense. French first, because his mother had been from Quebec and it had been in the house before he was old enough to choose. German because of 3 years in Zurich. Portuguese because of a project in Sao Paulo that had lasted longer than expected, and a woman he had met there who had been patient with him in a way he still thought about. Mandarin because of a business partner in Singapore who had suggested, not unkindly, that Walter would be more useful if he could follow a meeting without waiting for someone else to catch up. Romansh had come later, and oddly, a hiking trip in the Engadin Valley, a retired schoolteacher he had shared a cable car with for 45 minutes, a follow-up correspondence that had stretched, improbably, over 4 years. Walter had not pursued any of these languages with any particular ambition. They had simply arrived, and he had let them stay. After his wife died, after the work in logistics had stopped making any kind of sense to him, he had simplified everything. He had sold the condo in the annex. He had put most of his savings in a very boring index fund his accountant had recommended years earlier. He had taken the custodial job because it was quiet and uncomplicated and left him enough energy at the end of the day to read, which was what he mostly wanted to do. He had not expected it to matter. Most things about his previous life he had decided, firmly and without drama, no longer needed to matter, but Peter Lund had said what he said, and Walter had heard it. He waited until the meeting broke for a 15-minute recess at 3:30. The Stellarian delegation filed out toward the elevators. Geoffrey Park went to find coffee. Sandra Beaumont remained at the head of the table, reviewing something on her tablet. Walter wheeled his cart to the door, then stopped. He had a decision to make. He understood, with the clarity that comes from having been in enough rooms over enough years, exactly what kind of decision it was. He was a custodian. He was wearing a faded uniform. The woman at the head of the table had an MBA from Queen's, a corner office, and approximately no reason to take him seriously. He could walk out the door and go clean the stairwell on 34 and be home by 5:30. He turned around. "Ms. Beaumont," he said. She looked up. Her expression was polite and faintly distracted, the expression of someone who is being interrupted and is being courteous about it. "I apologize for interrupting," Walter said. "My name is Walter Pruitt. I've been with facilities for about 6 years. He paused. "I need to tell you something about what was said in that meeting." She looked at him for a moment. Then she set the tablet down. "Go ahead," she said. He told her what he had heard. He told her in plain, specific language. including the Romansh and then the translation. He told her about the Annex Clause comment and what it implied. He told her his background, briefly and without embellishment, not to establish credibility, but because he understood she would need to know why a man in a maintenance uniform was telling her something her interpreters had missed. Sandra Beaumont had built her career on the ability to read people quickly and accurately. It was the skill she trusted most. She looked at Walter Pruitt, his calm, his directness, the absence of anything performative in the way he stood there, and she made a judgment. She picked up her phone and called Jeffrey Park back into the room. "Pull the annex," she said. "Right now. Full review. I need you to look at the conversion rate mechanism and tell me what happens to our floor price if the volume minimums are triggered under the current euro rate." Jeffrey blinked. "We reviewed the annex in. Pull it again." He pulled it again. It took 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, Jeffrey Park sat back in his chair with an expression Walter recognized, the expression of someone who has just understood something they should have seen earlier. "The annex references a fixed conversion rate from 2019, Jeffrey said. "If we hit the minimum volume threshold, which we would, in years 2 and 3, the effective per-unit fee drops below our floor. We'd be losing approximately," he paused, working the number, "roughly between 18 and 22 million over the term, depending on volume." Sandra did not say anything for a moment. "Is there any reason," she said finally, "to think this was an oversight on their part?" Jeffrey looked at the document. "No," he said. "No, I don't think so." Sandra nodded slowly. Then she looked at Walter, who was still standing near the door with his hands folded. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "would you please stay until the delegation returns?" The second half of the meeting was different. When Peter Lund and his colleagues returned, Sandra was already at the head of the table with the annex open in front of her and Jeffrey Park at her side with a revised term sheet. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She simply said that her team had completed a review of the annex during the recess and had identified a discrepancy in the conversion rate mechanism that would need to be corrected before she could authorize the signing. She watched Peter Lund's face while she said it. He was very good. The reaction that crossed his features lasted less than a second before the professional composure reassembled itself. He said, in English, that of course he understood and that his team would need to consult with legal counsel. Then he said something to his colleague in Romansh. This time, Sandra's eyes moved to Walter, who was standing at the back of the room. Walter met her gaze and gave a small, precise nod. She turned back to Peter Lund and said, in a level voice, "We can reschedule for next week once your legal team has reviewed the corrected annex. I want to make sure we're both working from the same numbers." It was a gracious exit. Peter Lund took it. The delegation gathered their materials and left, and the energy in the room as they did was different from the energy when they had arrived. Jeffrey Park waited until the elevator doors had closed before he said, "We just avoided something very bad." "Yes," Sandra said. "We did." She looked at Walter. 3 days later, Sandra's assistant called Walter's mobile number. She had found it in the HR file and asked whether he would be available for a meeting with Miss Beaumont at 10 o'clock the following morning. Walter said he would check his schedule and call back. His schedule was entirely open. He called back 20 minutes later and confirmed. He wore the same clothes he wore every day. He took the 504 streetcar. He signed in at the security desk in the lobby the same way he always did, and he rode the elevator to 35, and he sat in the chair across from Sandra Beaumont's desk and waited while she finished a call. When she hung up, she looked at him for a moment. "I want to understand something," she said. "You heard that exchange, and you understood it immediately. But you waited until the recess to say anything. Why?" Walter considered the question. "I wanted to be sure I hadn't misheard," he said, "and I wanted to think about whether there was a chance I was wrong about what it meant. And were you wrong?" "No." She nodded. "Jeffrey has confirmed that the annex clause was not a drafting error. The conversion rate used was accurate as of 2019 and would have been known to be outdated. The clause was written to be difficult to catch. The reference is buried in a subschedule." She paused. "You caught it because of something you happened to overhear in a language almost no one speaks." "That's one way to put it," Walter said. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "how many languages do you actually speak?" He thought about it honestly. 8, he said. depending on how you count Romansh versus other Rhaeto-Romance dialects. Sandra Beaumont leaned back slightly. I've been running this company for 11 years, she said. I had $300 million on the table, and my interpreters couldn't follow the conversation in the room, and the person who caught it was the man refilling the water pitchers. I wasn't only refilling water pitchers, Walter said mildly. I also set up the glassware. Something shifted in her expression. It might have been the beginning of a smile. I'd like to know more about your background, she said, if you're willing to share it. He was willing. He told her about the logistics years, the offices in 4 continents, the contracts and the crossings, and the gradual accumulation of languages that had come from simply being present in places where other people were speaking them. He told her about his wife Ruth, who had died of a fast cancer 7 years ago and had left the downtown condo feeling like a place where the walls were too close. He told her about the decision to step back from everything that had felt, at the time, like choosing to get smaller, but which had turned out to feel, after a while, like something else. Sandra listened without interrupting. She was, Walter had noticed from the moment she had set down her tablet and looked at him in the boardroom, a person who listened the way some people didn't bother to anymore, with her full attention, without visible impatience. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. I owe you something, she said. You don't, Walter said. Harwick does, she said. And I'm the one who decides what Harwick owes. She looked out the window for a moment. The lake was visible from her office, gray-blue in the March light. I'd like to offer you a consulting arrangement, not a staff position if you'd prefer not, a contract. When we have international negotiations with parties who might use language strategically, I'd want you in the room. Your compensation would reflect what that's actually worth, not what your job title suggests. Walter looked at her. I want to be clear about something, he said. Go ahead. I'm not interested in a position that requires me to be someone I've already finished being, he said. I don't want an office. I don't need a title. What I do want, if you're serious about this, is a straightforward contract for a specific scope of work. I'd come in when you need me. I'd give you an honest assessment. I'd leave when the work is done. Sandra studied him. That's actually exactly what I'm proposing, she said. Then we can talk, Walter said. The contract was signed 6 weeks later. It was simple and specific, drafted by Harwick's legal team and reviewed at Walter's request by a lawyer he trusted, a woman he'd worked with in the logistics years who now had a practice in Kitchener. The scope was narrow, advisory support in multilingual negotiations, available on a per-engagement basis, at a rate that was, Jeffrey Parks said when he saw the number, frankly embarrassing given what it would have cost to not have someone like Walter in the room on March the 14th. Walter continued to live in the apartment in Parkdale. He continued to take the streetcar. He had, some years ago, bought a small share in a winery near Niagara-on-the-Lake on the advice of an old colleague, and the returns from that and the index fund meant that money was not something he spent much time worrying about. He did not advertise the consulting work. He did not mention it to his neighbors or to the people at the church in Mississauga, where he sometimes volunteered on Thursday mornings. He took 2 engagements in the first year, one in September, a pharmaceutical licensing negotiation, where one of the parties was running a version of the same conversion rate strategy Stellarian had attempted, this time in Dutch and Flemish across alternating clauses. The second in November, a supply chain dispute, where the issue turned out not to be language at all, but rather Walter's understanding of how certain contractual structures worked in Swiss law from his years in Zurich that the external counsel had missed. Both times he came in, sat quietly, listened, and said what he had heard and what it meant. Both times, the person running the meeting adjusted their strategy based on what he said. Sandra Beaumont called him after the November engagement. Jeffrey wants to know if you'd consider coming on as a permanent advisor, she said. Tell Jeffrey I appreciate the thought, Walter said. He anticipated that answer. He asked me to tell you the rate would double. Tell Jeffrey the rate was already fine. There was a pause. He also said to tell you that you remind him of his uncle, Sandra said, which I think is meant as a compliment. Tell Jeffrey thank you, Walter said, on a Tuesday in February, nearly a year after the boardroom meeting. Walter was in the lobby at Harwick, waiting for the elevator when he ran into one of the junior associates from the legal team. He had met her briefly during the November engagement. Her name was Priya Anand, and she was carrying 3 folders and a coffee cup and looking mildly overwhelmed. She recognized him. She had the slightly uncertain expression of someone who knows they know someone but isn't sure how. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. "Hello, Priya," he said. Are you consulting today?" "I have a meeting upstairs," he said. "Nothing formal." She nodded. Then she said, because she was young enough to still ask the questions she was curious about, "Can I ask you something? About March last year?" "Go ahead." "I wasn't in the boardroom," she said. "But I heard about what happened, and I've always wondered, when you heard what the Stellarian lead said, what made you decide to actually tell Ms. Beaumont? I mean," she searched for the diplomatic version, "you had to know it was a risk." Walter thought about it. He thought about the moment he had stood by the cart with his hands folded, with Peter Lund's words sitting in the middle of his chest, and the calculus he had done in the 10 seconds before he turned around. "It wasn't really about the risk," he said. "It was about whether I could walk out of that room having heard what I heard and still feel like someone I'd want to be." Priya looked at him for a moment. "That's it?" she said. "That's usually enough," Walter said. The elevator arrived. He held the door for her, and they rode up together in comfortable silence 35 floors above the city, the lake silver, and wide below them in the winter light.